As a channel with an intended philosophy of making content that looks to help and inform the interested audience, the existence of this video, with its melodramatic title that will likely ignite some contention and ill will in the comments section, is exactly the kind of content I wished to avoid producing, as it seems to be a slippery slope which can fast enable your audience's comments to descend into vitriolic discourse, which is consequently hard to recover from, at least from my experience reading comments on other channels. I originally intended to express the content of this video in a post on the War Robots forum that originally helped to get me started as a content maker. But if I did, then a large portion of my audience would be unlikely to see the post. Then, as I released content in the future that did not serve their intention for subscribing, said audience would likely grow dismayed and frustrated and continue to ask a question that would already have been answered. So, making a video on this is the most efficient means to send the message. To cut to the chase, I do not intend on making any more War Robots content for the foreseeable future. So, if you have subscribed for or just watch for War Robots content only, then I will no longer be able to serve your needs. I extend a heartfelt thank you for your support and feedback, and I hope I was able to provide you some value through my videos, and I wish you all the best. For those of you who are interested to know why I've made this decision, I will explain now. The gameplay of War Robots has morphed into something I no longer find any joy participating in. I'm not going to say whether these changes create an inferior experience to how the game used to play, because the notions of inferiority and superiority are generally subjective depending on the environment surrounding them. I will simply state how I see the game has changed over time, and you can make up your own mind as to whether they are good or not. Needless to say, I now find the gameplay in its current state to be shallow and uninteresting to the point that most matches are eye-rollingly predictable and vacuous affairs. The way weapons and robots have been adjusted has served to simplify and speed up combat engagements to a large degree, resulting in far less engagement from me as a player. Weapon damage, especially on premium weapons, has seen a large increase over progressive updates and time. But robot health and speed have only seen a minor increase by comparison. The large cumulative increase has severely lowered survival time in battle and further incentivizes high spike damage setups as the only viable means of competing. Most engagements now last a matter of seconds, with most fights ending in either destruction or sustaining heavy damage, with rarely any in between. These short engagement times allow for no meaningful planning or strategy to occur, and lacks any kind of complexity beyond basic positioning. It's simply charge in, clash, be destroyed, or heavily wounded most of the time. This kind of gameplay is no different to a child smashing his two toys together while making the appropriate sound effects until deciding who arbitrarily wins. In the case of War Robots, whoever looks at the enemy and fires first, or is a higher level, usually wins. In the past, War Robots, or Walking War Robots as it used to be called, very much allowed the player to experience the game in a manner that best suited them, with the features and mechanics provided. Meaning that if you wanted to avoid the homogeneous high-damage gameplay that typically was in the higher tiers, then the player simply needn't level their bots and weapons beyond a certain point. So the player could remain in an environment that featured a larger assortment of weapons and robots being put to use, and with that, a much greater variation of encounters to consider and overcome that would usually not destroy you within seconds unless you were playing carelessly. This variation naturally provided an incentive to strategize and experiment with differing setups and approaches to combat that did a good job not only putting a lot of the game's tools to use, but also keeping the player stimulated and engaged. Before the introduction of leagues, I used to hover around what was named the lower gold tier, with my robots and weapons at levels 8 to 9. Even at that higher level, the range of encounters were rich enough and, more importantly, lasted long enough to leave me with an impression of what actually happened and how it happened, and kept me constantly thinking about what other setups I could experiment with, often long after I had put the game down, making me eager to play again when I had the chance. And to top all this off, the means of experimentation were also realistically achievable in a decent amount of time with some good play. If you didn't wish to buy gold or silver, that is. Of course, for all its player freedom, it also brought with it its own problems, namely in the form of the somewhat perversely named seal clubbing. Seal clubbing was the name given to the act of players exploiting the loopholes of this system to create incredibly strong setups that would remain in a tier of significantly underpowered opponents by comparison, usually the new starters to the game, and these particular players would of course dominate almost all matches they played, and reap the rewards for doing so, as silver earning didn't scale well with levels and still doesn't to this day. Clearly, this all had to be addressed, as it would dissuade new players from continuing to play. But there was also another perceived problem with this player-driven system, in that it didn't require the player to be constantly in need of upgrading once they got to where they wanted, and so there, theoretically, was less incentive to spend real money in-game. An understandable and reasonable, but somewhat flawed concept that I will dissect in more detail a little later. But back to the history lesson. So, using the problem of seal clubbing as a catalyst, the league system was introduced, simultaneously dealing with both of these issues at the expense of player freedom, essentially forcing all players whom had more success than failure in the game to eventually face impossible odds in the form of significantly higher-leveled opponents or organized squads of clanmates, or both at the same time in the worst-case scenario. So the player now faced two choices. Continue to be dominated in entirely unfair games until you lose enough to eventually face fairer odds and repeat ad nauseam, or railroad yourself into a certain playstyle that coincidentally requires multiples of the strongest premium robots and weapons at high levels, that also require huge amounts of silver and time to upgrade. If you wish to continue playing the game, the most uncaring and masochistic of players would choose the first choice, whereas the regular players, who make up the vast majority, would naturally choose the second. And even then, as the regular player presses on to gather the silver and gold needed to compete, they still constantly face uphill battles against stronger opponents whom the game makes sure to match them with often, especially if their win rate dare creep above 60%, reminding you of just how much more powerful you need to be and just how ridiculously long that will still take to achieve. Unless, of course, you pay exorbitant amounts of money progressively or immediately. This is the current state of the matchmaking system, and whilst my description could be considered slightly exaggerated and dramatic, the fundamental core behavior is accurate and can be observed quite easily. Alongside the changes to matchmaking that now prioritizes the incentivization of monetization above all else, several mechanics and features have been changed to remove the thought process behind the more popular weapons. A lot of weapons used to possess characteristics that would require the player to have to consider more than just whether they were in range and had line of sight. The Orcan, possibly the most prolific and effective gold weapon, used to detonate at the target's current distance when fired, meaning they could be evaded with good use of distance baiting by faster robots and rapid movement abilities such as jump and rush. The user of the Orcan also had to account for their enemy's movement and lead their shots accordingly, increasing in difficulty with the speed of the enemy, a fair balancing act. After numerous damage buffs weren't enough, the projectile speed of the rocket was increased to make this less likely to happen, and the firing player had to lead their shots less. But good players were still able to avoid the vast majority of fire. So in the end, alongside more damage buffs, the mechanic was scrapped entirely. They now travel to their maximum range at a much faster speed regardless of the target's distance, removing any complexity and counterplay that once existed. The Columbus and Pin were changed to be able to fire as they are reloading, removing the need to have some forethought and planning prior to firing, as before the change you were then vulnerable during the reload time. However, this was fair, because it compensated for the relatively high damage at a longer range. But rather than lower the damage to compensate for the new change, the developers buffed the weapon instead, while only slightly reducing projectile flight time, which made no noticeable difference in gameplay, and taking most thought out of their use. The Gecko laser used to have to heat the target up sufficiently before doing its maximum damage, a well-considered balance mechanic that allowed the attacked player to get out of sight before receiving too much damage from very far away. If the player exposed themselves in the open for too long, then they would pay the price. That is not the case now, of course. A pattern with 4 maximum level geckos can inflict 60,000 damage in 5 seconds on an unshielded opponent without any consideration beyond having line of sight for that short time. Adding insult to injury, 4 maximum level fully charged trebuchets on a butch can inflict 73,000 damage within 2 seconds at maximum range. Utterly ridiculous and imbalanced numbers. And let's not forget how the changes to the rocket weapons have also made light robots completely redundant and obsolete by destroying any chance for counterplay by using their speed. Add to that, the myriad of buffs to all other weapons creates a thought and consequence-free environment for the users. All you need to do now is just level the weapons and your bot as high as you can, look toward the enemy, and fire first. Alongside the simplification of mechanics and gameplay, Pixonic's business practices have become more and more what I can only describe as insidious and exploitative towards their consumer base. The creation of new robots that are clearly designed to provide a significant advantage in health, speed, defensive abilities, and firepower in the new simplified environment without any drawbacks are one thing. They then originally made these robots only available through an in-game gambling system that was already incredibly difficult to earn credits to participate in. Bronze chests are realistically attainable, but if you were hoping for one of these new robots, then you stand a mere 0.04% chance per 4 to 5 games of earning enough credits to open a chest. Most of the time, though, you just win back less credits than you spent. As of writing this script, the component system has been recently released on Android, which graciously offers players more methods with which to attain the new weapons and robots. Components to assemble these items can now be won from chests and bought for real money. However, it seems, predictably, the amount of components needed are quite absurd in contrast to what you earn from chests. And unless you pay a literal huge amount of real money, you have no say on which components you obtain from these chests, leaving it all to a random number generator that is heavily stacked against you. Contrast this to how, in the past, we used to simply need to amass enough or purchase gold or workshop points for any new releases, both of which were fairly distributed in a monetized, free-to-play environment. However, now, paying outright for one of the new robots under the new system will cost you somewhere between $200 to $300 American dollars. Utterly absurd. Some of you might be subscribed to the idea that the prices are so ridiculous as so to limit the amount of people who can pay, and thus the amount of these robots on the field will be limited and not overpowering. And I will admit, this does have an element of truth to it. Pixonic did this in the earlier days of the game, making the Fury and Lancelot the equivalent of around $50 worth of gold to buy, which by itself was already an unreasonable asking price for a mobile game, although not completely absurd and beyond reach for the average consumer. However, this argument is flawed for 2 reasons. First, a key difference is that the past premium robots possessed clear balancing considerations to offset their advantages in battle, and could be outplayed by a skilled and suitably equipped opponent using a lesser robot. Secondly, if we look back on the last year of the game, there was a clear issue with the amount of Furies and Lancelots with certain weapon configurations becoming so abundant in higher level play that it became a large balance issue. If you didn't possess at least one or more of these robots, you were at a significant disadvantage. The same will eventually happen with the new robots. Time will increase their numbers on the field and once again upset the ecosystem and force you to pay up or face overwhelming odds again and again. Pixonic are not stupid. They know this will eventually happen, and it will prompt the next batch of premium robots and weapons that completely outclass the last, undoing most of the equilibrium from before, and so the cycle begins anew. Let's stop to think about the black market system for a moment so we can realize just how contemptuous and exploitative it is towards the player. Upon introduction of the black market as a permanent feature, if you have your sights set on a particular robot or weapon and wish to earn it before the introduction of components, the black market only offered you the ability to pay for a chance to get what you wanted. You hand over your own money for their system to grant you permission to take a roll of chance with the hopes it will give you something you want or need, of which that chance is never greater than 3.5 or 12% for a complete item if you take the most expensive roll. These statistics are readily available and published by Pixonic, and I will leave a link to them in the description. Components have allowed a means of direct purchase, but their introduction further dilutes the prize pool and thus your chances of getting what you want. And as I've already said, their monetary cost is absurd. Oh, and they can only be obtained from 100 credit silver chests onwards, meaning that it would take, on average, 40 to 50 games to earn enough for a silver chest without paying real money. The average game now takes around 8 minutes to complete, so that's over 5 hours of in-game playtime at the bare minimum to earn enough for a chance to get a fraction of something you need, provided you actually get the components you want, which you probably won't. Let's apply this business methodology to a real-world scenario. Imagine you go to a cake shop and spy a delicious-looking cake for £20 that you would very much like to try, and you only want to try this cake. You find the assistant and tell them you wish to purchase this cake, but you're then told that the cake cannot be bought individually for just £20, but rather it exists within a tier of 5 other cakes of which you must pay that £20 to spin a wheel that will randomly choose one of those cakes for you to have. If you get a cake you don't want, then tough. You pay again and spin again. Would you accept this business practice as fair and customer-friendly? Let's add the equivalent of the component system to this example. Now, aside from the other 4 cakes, there are also cake crumbs of varying amounts of 10 to 200 for each different cake you can win added to the spin. Once you amass 1,000 of the same type of crumbs for that cake, then you may finally claim it. If you wish to bypass this process, you have 2 choices. You either pay £300 upfront for the cake instead, or you work in the shop for many hours over many days to earn a spin. Oh, but now the wheel contains extra items such as cookies and a whole other manner of useless things to further dilute your chances. I ask again, would you accept this business practice as fair and consumer-friendly? My cake example also fails to highlight just how exploitative this business model is, depending on what item is being offered. Whether or not you get the cake in the end likely won't have any effect on the success you have in the world around you. But War Robots is holding game-changing features to ransom, and your success and status in the game world is very much dependent on owning these items, exemplifying the exploitation of the consumer being put to practice. Pixonic are by no means the first company to do this. They are simply following suit from what other big game companies are doing to exploit their player base's addictive traits and competitive spirit, both of which usually go hand in hand. A survival imperative for any company is to earn money. It's just a shame that a company and game that at first demonstrated an awareness for a meaningful game experience, balanced with a monetization system that was reasonable and considered the game ecosystem, has chosen to treat its game and its players in such a disrespectful way. I said earlier in the video I would dissect how the notion of always requiring players to progress in order to get them to spend is flawed, and will do so now. What I'm about to say can be thought of as a commentary and observation of the game industry as a whole, and not only singling out War Robots for this practice. Most popular games today, and for several years prior, have operated under the assumption that if a player is not progressing through some kind of statistical and/or arbitrary system, that they would have no incentive to play once reaching a certain level. Call of Duty 4 Modern Warfare was the first popular mainstream game to really show this mindset in action. For many players, this is true, and their expectations and reasons for participating in the game are as shallow as the features offered to them. These type of players often lack patience, desire instant gratification, do not comprehend or tolerate deeper mechanics that are beyond their immediate grasp, and are quick to reject and move on to other things if mentally challenged beyond a few seconds of thought. These players are often referred to as the lowest common denominator, people whom value convenience and instant gratification over challenge. And so game companies have adapted to offer convenience and instant gratification in their games more and more throughout the years, filling the game industry with products that offer such things using exploitative practices such as the one highlighted in this video. There seems to be some kind of consensus among the suits of these companies that it is the only way to maintain commercial success in an ever more vapid society. It's logical, but flawed, and looks only to short-term gain from a fickle, ever-changing demographic. Games are unique in that they provide an interactive world for the player to exist in. This world can be as complex as the developers want them to be, and the result of these worlds is the formation of a community by those whom choose to inhabit them. The strength of this community is determined by the strength of meaningful stimulation this world can offer them. If good enough, people stick around, become more attached and protective of the world and its community, and are very willing to support it. It becomes an important part of their lives, and as such will want to see it grow and be well. News is spread of this world, and a reputation is developed. Gradually, this reputation spreads, and popularity is gained at a steady pace, as does its support. All of this is dependent on the creators taking appropriate care of the world and its inhabitants. Mistreatment and disrespect can be tolerated to a point, but if pushed too far, will have dire results. This whole process ties neatly into our nature as social creatures and is inherently more fulfilling on all levels. This method can be very lucrative for the creators of said world, but it is all a long-term process dependent on a subsection of players whom are able to comprehend and invest themselves in the deeper world on offer and are trusted to have the intelligence to do so at their own accord. A huge amount of these players exist, but a lot of these players also don't know that they are these type of players. It is the developer's responsibility to help bring this side of the player to the forefront with good game design to show them the way, and have a little trust in the player's intelligence. As I have already said, it is a long-term process, but ultimately the player will be thankful for the experience you have given them, and shall show you great loyalty and support. Think to some of the most beloved gaming franchises of years past, which are now being bled dry through insidious corporate exploitation of their players. They developed their reputation as beloved through many years of care and respect for the world and its inhabitants. War Robots is an online PvP mobile game, and thus would never be expected to possess the kind of world I've just elaborated on. At the very least, though, it showed those core considerations and respect for the player and the world they had created within the confines of its platform. It set a standard for itself, and as its community formed and grew more and more, spawning forums and wikis and voice chat servers dedicated to the game, the excitement and potential for such a platform was great. That last paragraph I spoke is also a big reason why this video exists, because the long-term potential the game showed is now in stark contrast to what it has become in my eyes. It is a great shame, but it is what it is. War Robots is now very much pay to win, and for me is now a shallow game experience that is no longer suitable for myself. I want to say thank you to Pixonic for providing the game and the entertainment it's given over the years. And of course I want to say thank you to the community that has supported me in making videos, given me feedback and helped to get my channel where it is today. a place I never imagined it could or would be. As for the future of this channel, I will continue to produce content such as reviews, critiques, and whatever else I think being worthwhile. All with the proviso of being informative, worth your time, and hopefully thought-provoking. And I will very likely be providing Battle of Titans content in the future, where and when necessary. We will see. This ends the video. Thank you very much for watching, and of course, thank you very much for your time.